the Prophet Muhammad received what Muslims believe to be divine revelation around 610 CE, founding the religion of Islam. Within decades of his death, in 632 CE, Arab Muslim armies swept out of Arabia with astonishing speed and force. In 638 CE, the Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, entered Jerusalem peacefully, accepting the city's surrender. This was a turning point of profound consequence. Jerusalem, already sacred to Jews and Christians, became sacred to Muslims as well. The city is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, which includes the rock from which Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during his night journey. Jerusalem became the third holiest city in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. Under early Islamic rule, the region now called Jund Philistine, or the province of Palestine, experienced relative religious tolerance. Jews, who had been largely excluded under Byzantine rule, were permitted to return to Jerusalem. Christians continued to practice their faith and maintain their holy sites. Arabic gradually became the dominant language, and Islam the dominant religion. As the local population, a diverse mix of peoples who had lived in this land through centuries of different rulers, converted and assimilated over time. The Umayyad Caliphate, based in Damascus, built the magnificent Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in 691 CE, one of the oldest and most beautiful Islamic structures in the world. Its golden dome, still defining the Jerusalem skyline today. In 1095, Pope Urban II issued a call to the Christian kingdoms of Europe to launch a holy war to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The response was overwhelming. Waves of crusaders, knights, soldiers, and pilgrims from across Europe marched toward the Holy Land. In 1099, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in a brutal siege. The massacre that followed was horrific. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city were slaughtered in large numbers. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Christian feudal state in the heart of the Islamic world. For nearly a century, the Crusaders controlled Jerusalem and much of Palestine. They built castles, churches, and fortifications across the land. But they were always an occupying force in a hostile region, and their grip was never fully secure. In 1187, the great Muslim general Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, defeated the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. Unlike the Crusaders before him, Saladin was largely merciful in victory, allowing Christians to ransom their freedom and guaranteeing the safety of holy sites. His recapture of Jerusalem was celebrated across the Muslim world. Further crusades followed, but none succeeded in permanently retaking Jerusalem. By 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in the region, the city of Acre, fell, and the Crusader era came to an end. Following the Crusades, Palestine came under the control of the Mamluks, a dynasty of warrior slaves who ruled from Cairo. Under Mamluk rule, Palestine was relatively stable, though it was a peripheral province rather than a center of power. The Mamluks fended off both the remaining Crusaders and the devastating Mongol invasions that were sweeping across the Islamic world. In 1516, a new power arrived. The Ottoman Turks under Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks and incorporated Palestine into the vast Ottoman Empire. Ottoman rule would last for 400 years, shaping the land, its people, and its administrative divisions in ways that still echo today. Under the Ottomans, Palestine was divided into administrative districts. Jerusalem was given special status as a holy city. The Ottomans renovated and rebuilt key structures, including the walls of Jerusalem's Old City that still stand today, built during the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. During the Ottoman centuries, Palestine was home to a predominantly Arab Muslim population. With significant Arab Christian communities and a smaller but continuous Jewish presence, particularly in the holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. Pilgrims from across the world continued to flow in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim alike, drawn to the sacred geography of this ancient land. Life in Ottoman Palestine was largely agricultural. Villages dotted the hillsides, growing olives, wheat, and citrus. Merchants traded in the souks of Jerusalem, Gaza, and Nablus. The land was poor in resources but rich in history, and it sustained its people in relative, if sometimes difficult, stability for generations. The 19th century brought dramatic changes that set the stage for the conflicts of the modern era. In Europe, the condition of Jewish communities was deteriorating. Despite periods of relative tolerance, Jews faced systemic discrimination, legal restrictions, and periodic waves of violent persecution known as pogroms, particularly in the Russian Empire, where millions of Jews lived in desperate poverty under brutal oppression. Out of this suffering grew a political movement called Zionism, articulated most powerfully by a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl. After witnessing the virulent anti-Semitism on display during the Dreyfus Affair in France, in which a Jewish French army officer was falsely convicted of treason, Herzl concluded that Jews could never be safe in Europe. They needed a state of their own. In 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, formally establishing the Zionist organization and declaring the goal of creating a Jewish homeland. Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, was the primary focus of this vision. Herzl famously wrote in his diary after the Congress, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state." At the same time, a parallel movement was awakening among the Arab people. Arab nationalism was rising across the Ottoman world, fueled by a growing sense of shared cultural identity, language, and history. Palestinian Arabs, who made up the vast majority of the population at the time, were developing their own sense of identity and connection to the land. These two nationalisms, Zionism and Arab nationalism, were on a collision course, and the stage was about to be set by the catastrophic upheaval of the First World War. When the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany, Britain saw an opportunity. The British made a series of promises during the war that would prove fatally contradictory. In 1915, in correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the British indicated support for Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The Arabs rose up, fighting alongside British forces and helping to liberate Arab lands from Ottoman control. But in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The declaration stated that Britain viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stipulating that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This single document, less than 100 words, would reverberate through history. It was made without consulting the Arab population of Palestine, who comprised roughly 90% of the people living there at the time. Meanwhile, Britain and France had secretly agreed to divide the Middle East between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, carving up the region into spheres of influence that bore little relationship to the actual communities, histories, or wishes of the people who lived there. When British General Edmund Allenby marched into Jerusalem in December 1917, Ottoman rule over Palestine ended after 4 centuries. The British now controlled the land, and they were holding incompatible promises to multiple peoples. After the war, the League of Nations formally granted Britain the mandate for Palestine and administrative authority charged with governing the territory and facilitating the establishment of a Jewish national home, while also protecting the rights of the existing population. The British were now responsible for a land where tensions were rising rapidly. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly during the 1920s and 1930s, particularly as persecution of Jews in Europe intensified. Jewish immigrants purchased land, established farms and towns, built institutions, and created the infrastructure of what they hoped would become a Jewish state. The Arab Palestinian population watched this transformation with growing alarm. They feared displacement from their land, their homes, and their future. Arab-Jewish violence flared repeatedly in 1920, 1929, and throughout the 1930s. The British found themselves caught between two peoples with irreconcilable national aspirations, trying to manage a crisis that was spiraling beyond their control. In 1936, a major Arab revolt broke out against both British rule and Jewish immigration. The British suppressed it harshly, but it was a sign of how deeply the conflict had taken root. Then came the Holocaust. The systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children by the Nazi regime between 1941 and 1945 was one of the greatest crimes in human history. The survivors who emerged from the death camps of Europe had nowhere to go. Many had lost their entire families. Their communities had been obliterated. European countries were unwilling or unable to absorb them. And the world, including the United States, turned away hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in the years before and during the war. The moral urgency of creating a Jewish homeland intensified with devastating force. Jewish immigration to Palestine surged, sometimes illegally as the British tried to limit it. Jewish paramilitary groups fought the British as well as Arab forces. The situation in Palestine became ungovernable. Exhausted by war and overwhelmed by competing pressures, Britain handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, the United Nations proposed a Partition Plan Resolution 181, which called for dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the plan, though many felt the proposed Jewish state was far from ideal. Arab leaders, both Palestinian and across the broader Arab world, rejected it entirely. They argued that the plan was fundamentally unjust, that a majority of the population could not simply be told to share their land with those who had arrived more recently, however terrible the circumstances that drove their arrival. Violence immediately escalated. By the time British forces withdrew from Palestine, full-scale war had broken out. On the 14th of May, 1948, in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The next day, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded. What followed was a war that each side remembers in entirely different terms. For Israelis, it is the War of Independence, a miraculous victory against overwhelming odds that secured the survival of the Jewish state and fulfilled the Zionist dream. For Palestinians, it is the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. During the war, approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. Villages were destroyed. Families were separated, and entire people became refugees overnight. The war ended in 1949 with armistice agreements. Israel controlled significantly more territory than the UN Partition Plan had proposed. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. There was no Palestinian state. The Palestinian refugees and their descendants would remain in camps across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian territories for decades. Their right to return a central demand that has never been resolved. The years between 1948 and 1967 were marked by ongoing tension, periodic violence, and the hardening of positions on all sides. For Palestinian refugees living in camps, life was a painful limbo, displaced from their homes, but refusing to forget them. The keys to houses that no longer existed became symbols of a right to return that they passed down to their children and grandchildren. For Israelis, these years were defined by the challenge of building a new state, absorbing waves of Jewish immigrants from Europe and from Arab countries, many of whom faced persecution and were expelled from their homes in the wake of the 1948 war. Israel had to create an economy, a military, and a functioning democracy virtually from scratch, all while living under the constant threat of conflict. Arab states refused to recognize Israel and maintained a state of formal hostility. Fedayeen Palestinian fighters launched cross-border raids into Israel. Israel retaliated, often with disproportionate force. The cycle of violence became self-perpetuating. In 1956, Israel, Britain, and France launched a military campaign against Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Though militarily successful, the campaign was a political disaster. The United States and Soviet Union both pressured the invaders to withdraw, and the episode ended with Nasser's prestige vastly increased across the Arab world. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded, establishing for the first time a formal political body claiming to represent the Palestinian people. Under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who took control of the organization in 1969, the PLO would become the central political voice of Palestinian nationalism, though its methods, including terrorist attacks on civilians, would make it deeply controversial. In June 1967, everything changed in 6 days. Tensions had been building for months. Arab states massed troops on Israel's borders. Egypt expelled UN peacekeepers and blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's access to the Red Sea, an act Israel considered an act of war. Israel struck first with a massive preemptive airstrike that destroyed the Egyptian Air Force while most of its planes were still on the ground. In the days that followed, Israeli ground forces moved with stunning speed. In the south, they captured the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In the east, they fought Jordan and captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, with its Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. In the north, they captured the Golan Heights from Syria. In 6 days, Israel had tripled the territory under its control and placed 1 million Palestinian Arabs under military occupation. The capture of East Jerusalem was particularly momentous. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan walked through the Lion's Gate into the Old City, and Israeli soldiers stood weeping at the Western Wall, a site Jews had been denied access to under Jordanian rule. For Israel, it was a moment of profound, almost miraculous fulfillment. For Palestinians, it was another catastrophe. The entire Palestinian population of the West Bank and Gaza now lived under Israeli military occupation. A new wave of refugees fled east across the Jordan River. The 6-day war fundamentally transformed the conflict. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 242, calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and recognition of all states in the region to live in peace. The Land for Peace formula it established would become the basis of every subsequent peace negotiation, though what exactly it meant in practice remained deeply contested. The decades of Israeli occupation that followed were marked by the steady expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, a policy that would prove one of the most contentious aspects of the conflict. Jewish settlers, motivated by religious, ideological, and economic reasons, began building communities in the occupied territories, supported by successive Israeli governments. Palestinians saw this as a deliberate colonization of land they intended for their future state. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. They initially caught Israel off guard and made significant gains, but Israel rallied and eventually pushed back. The war ended inconclusively, but led ultimately to the Camp David Accords in 1978, brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Egypt and Israel signed a peace treaty, the first between Israel and an Arab state, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. It was a breakthrough, but the Palestinian question remained unresolved. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, targeting PLO bases from which attacks on northern Israel had been launched. The invasion led to the siege of Beirut, the evacuation of PLO fighters, and one of the darkest moments of the conflict, the massacre of Palestinian civilians in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, carried out by Lebanese Christian militias while Israeli forces stood by. Israel's own Kahan Commission found that Israeli commanders bore indirect responsibility. By the late 1980s, Palestinians living under occupation had reached a breaking point. In December 1987, an uprising began in the refugee camps of Gaza and spread rapidly across the occupied territories. This was the First Intifada, a popular, largely grassroots uprising characterized by stone-throwing youths confronting Israeli soldiers, strikes, and civil disobedience. The images of the Intifada shocked the world and changed the international perception of the conflict. The Intifada also elevated the importance of internal Palestinian leadership, including a new organization called Hamas, founded in 1987, which combined Islamic ideology with Palestinian nationalism and rejected any compromise with Israel. The end of the Cold War and the First Gulf War created new political dynamics that, for a moment, seemed to open the possibility of peace. In 1993, in a stunning diplomatic breakthrough, Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords mutual recognition agreements that established the Palestinian Authority as a self-governing body in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. On the White House lawn, Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands before a beaming President Clinton. The world dared to hope. But Oslo was a framework, not a final agreement. It left the hardest issues: the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the future of Israeli settlements, and the borders of a Palestinian state to future negotiations. Those negotiations would prove impossible. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist who opposed the peace process. The killing shook Israel and the peace process to its core. Negotiations continued through the 1990s but made little progress. In 2000, at the Camp David summit brokered by President Clinton, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat met for intensive talks. When they failed to reach an agreement with deep disagreements over Jerusalem and refugees, the process collapsed. Each side blamed the other. In September 2000, Ariel Sharon, then leader of the Israeli opposition, made a provocative visit to the Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem, escorted by hundreds of security forces. It was the spark that ignited the Second Intifada. Unlike the first, this uprising was characterized by horrific violence on both sides: suicide bombings in Israeli restaurants, buses, and nightclubs that killed hundreds of civilians, and massive Israeli military operations in Palestinian cities that caused enormous casualties and destruction. The Second Intifada fundamentally changed the political landscape. The Israeli public, traumatized by suicide bombings, swung sharply to the right. The Palestinian Authority under Arafat was discredited in many Israeli eyes as a partner for peace. The international community watched in horror as the death toll mounted on both sides. In 2004, Yasser Arafat died a figure of enormous controversy, revered by Palestinians as their national symbol and condemned by many Israelis and Westerners as the architect of terrorism. His death left a leadership vacuum. In 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who had built his career as a hardliner, made the unexpected decision to unilaterally withdraw Israeli settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip. It was a significant step, but it did not lead to peace. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections, defeating Fatah, the dominant political party of the Palestinian Authority. The following year, Hamas seized control of the Gaza Strip in a violent internal conflict, splitting Palestinian political authority. The West Bank came under the control of the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas. Gaza came under Hamas control. Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza. Hamas fired rockets into Israeli territory. Israel launched military operations in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, and repeatedly thereafter, with devastating consequences for Gaza's civilian population. The death tolls in these conflicts were heavily asymmetric, with Palestinian casualties including thousands of civilians far exceeding Israeli losses, though the suffering on all sides was real and profound. Today, the situation in Palestine and Israel remains one of the world's most intractable conflicts. The Palestinian people remain divided. The West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, Gaza under Hamas. Israeli settlements in the West Bank have grown to include hundreds of thousands of settlers, making the practical realization of a contiguous Palestinian state increasingly difficult. The status of Jerusalem claimed as capital by both Israelis and Palestinians remains one of the most explosive, unresolved issues on earth. Palestinian refugees, now numbering in the millions when their descendants are counted, still live in camps across the region, holding on to the memory and the claim of return. The international community has largely consensus on the need for a two-state solution, an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. But the gap between that aspiration and political reality has never felt wider. In October 2023, the conflict reached another devastating turning point. Hamas launched a massive and horrific attack on southern Israel. the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust, killing approximately 1,200 people, including civilians and children, and taking hundreds hostage. Israel's military response in Gaza was massive and catastrophic, resulting in tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties, the displacement of nearly the entire population of Gaza, and the destruction of vast swaths of its infrastructure. The world watched in anguish, divided in its responses, united only in the knowledge that the suffering was immense and the path forward was deeply unclear. This is the history of Palestine, a land that has known so many rulers and so much suffering, yet has never ceased to inspire fierce devotion in those who call it home. It is a history too easily reduced to simple narratives of good and evil, of victims and villains. The reality is far more complex, more heartbreaking, and more human than any single story can contain. It is a history of two peoples, both with genuine historical connections to this land, both with legitimate fears and legitimate aspirations, caught in a conflict that has defied every attempt at resolution. The ancient stones of Jerusalem have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of three of the world's great religions, centuries of coexistence, and centuries of violence. They have watched conquerors come and go, and they have watched ordinary people, farmers, merchants, teachers, and children try to build their lives amid forces far beyond their control. Understanding this history does not make the solutions easier, but it is the necessary beginning of any honest conversation about what justice, peace, and a shared future might look like for the people of this extraordinary, ancient, and tormented land. The story of Palestine is not over. It is being written still in the lives of millions of people who deserve, above all else, the simple, radical gift of peace.